Now that Brant has been out for a couple of days, it's time to look on his release and see how good is Brant actually. Was I right or not? First, I'm going to discuss his performance within the Tower of Adversity. Second off, I'm going to discuss his performance within Whimpering Wastes. And then finally, I'm going to go past all the points I made in my pros and cons video and see if I was correct or not. Starting off with his performance within the Tower of Adversity. Now, I'm gonna go out and say it. I think that Brant is a good character in Tower. Is he amazing? No, he's definitely not a Carlotta or anything. But Brant definitely has his own advantages within Tower that make him a very strong character to use here. And I think one of his biggest advantages is the sheer amount of teams you can play him in. Almost every single character in the game has some kind of use for Brant. And if they don't, then, well, you need 3 teams anyway, so it's not like Brant is entirely unusable. If you already have 3 full teams, then you shouldn't even be asking yourself, is this character worth using? Because at that point, it's more about personal preference. So let's go over that. I think that Brant's best team is something that's going to depend entirely on circumstance. Because, obviously, Wuthering Waves has a lot of different characters, and Brant's kit design is honestly insanely smart. Brant has the benefit of being a sub-DPS character who is also very capable of main DPSing and quick swapping. Have we seen this before? Kind of, because with characters like Changli or Phoebe, there is very much a big preference towards going towards one side of the spectrum, whereas with Brant, he can very easily do every single role at once. He doesn't have 2 modes like Phoebe, so he's able to access all of the parts of his kit without having to restrict himself out of other parts. This means the sheer amount of characters he works with is very large. He can work with Changli in both a hyper carry and a dual carry setting. He can also work with Carlotta and Jinchi when he's trying to buff them as a hyper carry, and he can also quick swap using both of them. He can quick swap with Shang Liao. He can quick swap with Havoc Rover. He can quick swap with Phoebe. The amount of teams you can make with Brant in them is kind of absurd. But how do these teams perform is the question. Well, they perform pretty well, all of them. Brant has the ability to kill bosses really fast if you play him correctly. And even if you're not as good at the game as other people, it's still going to do pretty well. Within the second stage of the middle tower, the clears I got were usually around the 1 minute mark, maybe a bit faster. But considering the fact that the current tower is very much benefiting Brant as much as possible, I think this is not really as impressive as it normally would be. Although I still think that Brant, for many months to come, will be able to easily clear within tower. And the sheer amount of team selections he has means that no matter what your account looks like, or no matter what the enemy spread is, Brant will almost always be usable. Even if the floor has fusion resistance, you can just run him to support a Jinchi or a Carlotta, meaning that he can be used in almost every scenario. This is also helped by the fact that his personal damage is quite large. He has some of the highest damage per rotation of any sub-DPS character, meaning that even if you play him with a DPS that isn't as strong, Brant is able to carry some of that weight himself. So while I think he is by no means some kind of broken character, he's definitely good. Moving on to Whimpering Wastes, which I think is a bit more decisive when it comes to Brant. Brant definitely has a lot of good parts, but also a bunch of parts that I don't think mesh that well for the game mode. First of all, while I didn't really discuss this man's targeting for tower, because, well, he seemed to be fine there, it's mainly boss oriented, when you take him to WhiWa, you're gonna see that if there's this one enemy that's split off from the group, he almost always chooses to target that one. I don't know what it is with this guy. His targeting on his anchor and his intro skill is incredibly goofy, and sometimes just decides to not work. It's kind of funny, but also really annoying. Brant for this game mode is incredibly team reliant in order to perform. If you put him in a hypercarry team, chances are you're going to barely scrape by when it comes to your points. So you really want to play Brant in a more supportive role here, primarily with, you guessed it, Changli. Now, Brant is entirely carried by Changli in terms of value for Whimpering Wastes, if you ask me. This is because Changli already had an incredible baseline when it comes to WhiWa. She just has such good AoE in such good consistent chunks, which is exactly what this game mode wants. While she may not be at the level of GN or Camellia just yet, she definitely is up there with the rest of the S-tier WhiWa characters, especially now that we have Brant, because now Changli has the option to play casually. So if you're not that good at the game, well, good job. You can get yourself a Brant, and then get yourself a Changli, and WhiWa should just be running in fear. This combination of characters might be some of the best damaging characters when it comes to all of Whimpering Wastes. It's not like Brant is entirely helpless without Changli either, because if you choose to quick swap him with someone like Shangliao or Jinshi, he will perform pretty well actually, but that's about it. You kind of only have quick swap and then hyper carry with Changli. All the other teams aren't going to be as strong, but Brant does have some pretty unique properties that bolster his performance within Whimpering Wastes. The biggest one in my opinion being the fact that his Forte's nuke actually has a lingering hitbox that sits around for about half a second. This means that if you aim it properly, Brant is able to nuke multiple waves with one ability, something that we haven't seen since Jinshi's ultimate. And considering just how much damage that Forte can do at times, it's kind of ridiculous just how many waves you're able to kill with this alone. Even though it's one big nuke, because its lingering hitbox is there, you're able to kill multiple waves, and thus he's not as helpless in WhiWa as you would initially think. But now that we've discussed his performance in both of the game modes, it's time to look back on my pros and cons video and see if I was actually right. First of all, his ability to be a quick swapper. Now initially, I was not really playing this team comp correctly. I was trying to use his charged basic attacks and trying to on-field Brant as much as possible, not realizing that the thing I wanted to actually exploit for swap cancels was Brant's flip. As a swap cancel character, he's definitely not as good as Changli, as I figured, but he's definitely very good, and is able to synergize with all the regular quick swap characters, with the exception of a few, like maybe Phoebe and Kolcharo being a bit more iffy to use. But outside of those, Brant has all the flexibility with his rotations needed in order to play quick swappy. Now, I will say another downside is the fact that his ultimate's buff has a 12-second duration, but that's fine. You don't need to always have his Forte buff up. Next up, I said that him being able to buff skills is an incredible piece of utility that means that he'll have more value than if he were, let's say, a basic attack or a heavy attack buffer. This is because basic attack and heavy attacks already have good generalist buffers in the form of Sanhua and Mortefi, whereas skills kind of have Taochi and Lumi, who are some of the worst characters in the game. So Brant being able to buff skills with his outro is some pretty nice utility to have. And while he's not best in slot with any of the skill damage dealers, other than Changli of course, he is still a viable pick with both Jinshi as well as Carlotta, so I think I was also right here. I also mentioned Brant's mobility, which is less than I expected to be honest, because if Brant cannot hit the enemy from where he is, he will cancel his basic attack chain and plunge down. This can be pretty annoying if you're fighting a boss like the Tempest Mephis that likes to create distance, but if you're fighting something like the Impermanence Heron that likes going into the air, Brant's aerial attacks are perfect for the occasion. So while I wasn't completely right, it was still a good point. I briefly talked about his healing and said how it was more of a nice bonus rather than an actual reason to use Brant over any other character, which I feel still remains true. His healing is a pretty good buff, but not really something I would consider to be a big bonus. As for negatives, I definitely said that he was going to be hard to build. That was the main thing I talked about with Brant. And I'm gonna be so honest with you, yeah, he is really hard to build. If you get his signature, you will try to get him on ER Fusion, but then you'll need so many ER substats that good luck. If you decide to go for double ER, have fun not getting too many ER substats, because if you get too many, suddenly you're overcapping. if you don't get his signature at all, good luck getting the ER to even reach Tidebreaking's requirement, which is going to be damn hard. Now obviously a lot of the problems come from Tidebreaking Courage as a set, and not so much from Brant himself. So if you decide to go for Molten Rift, you'll probably be fine no matter what you do. But that is a damage loss over Tidebreaking Courage, meaning that you're just simply losing out on damage, and the optimal way to do it is to just grind for those ER subs. Brant being hard to build is definitely still his biggest negative. I also talked about the potential of him being hard to play due to his quick swap nature, but I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I was right here. Brant's regular Concerto rotation for just playing as a sub DPS is short enough to where you can just easily go with this route and then play something like Chengli Hypercarry or even run him with Jinxie or Carlotta. I think that even if you're not that good at the game, Brant will find his uses, and while he definitely may lose some due to losing his quick swap teams, he definitely isn't locked to them, so he's not hard to play at a baseline. And then finally, I talked about his Concerto rotation being longer than other sub DPSs, which, while it is true, I think is kind of a nitpick, because it's not as long as I originally suspected. I thought it was going to be around 10 seconds, but Brant proved me wrong by being closer to the 8-second mark, even going to 7 seconds, which is actually comparable to other sub DPSs that we have in the game already. And Brant makes up for this by having pretty high damage output compared to other sub DPS characters. So Brant honestly doesn't really mind from this issue. So what do you think of Brant? Do you think he's a strong character, maybe one of the best in the game? Do you think he's just fine, or do you think he's bad? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. If you have any questions, be sure to join my Discord. I'm pretty active in there, so any question you ask, there's a high chance I'm going to respond to it. But that'll be it from me. Peace.